All right, so one of the things that I want to introduce here is that when we are looking at sustainability problems and when we are dealing with sustainability problems, we're not just looking at problems that are more complex or more difficult. We're looking at a totally different class of problems than we're used to. And because of that, we really need to approach these problems with different strategies. So what does that mean? Sustainability scientists refer to the problems that are faced within the field as wicked problems. This is probably a new term for most people. The wicked problems are problems that are so complex and so multifaceted that they span entire systems. And because of that, they have a host of characteristics that makes them incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to solve. So every problem in a wicked problem is unique, right? There are no two wicked problems that are the same. And as you try to address wicked problems, it gets more and more complicated and more difficult. So the problem changes even from what it was when you started addressing the problem. You have wicked problems that affect multiple stakeholders. Each of those stakeholders could have different agendas. So if you think maybe about climate change, it's impacting people in different parts of our country in different ways, but also each of those groups of people may have different interests in how to solve climate change. And solutions to sustainability problems, to wicked problems, they start in one location or one part of that problem, and they sort of have like a ripple effect where they go through the rest of the system, and they impact it in very complicated ways that can actually make it more and more difficult for people in other parts of the problem to solve them. And let me give you a kind of a more concrete example. So how does ozone depletion affect your health? This is ozone depletion, the loss of our ozone layer or depletion of our ozone layer was a huge problem when I was in grade school. This was something that terrified me. I spent a lot of time obsessively reading about all of the problems in terms of increased cancer, in terms of how it affected frog populations, et cetera. And so this was something that was like a nightmare to me in my youth, right? What happens if we lose our ozone layer? Well, that may sound like a really complicated problem, a difficult problem, but when it comes to trying to understand how it impacts your health, we know exactly what it does. When you increase the ozone depleting substances like refrigerants, for example, or propellants, those substances deplete the ozone layer. That means that we have an increased exposure to ultraviolet rays, and people get sunburned, they get eye damage, and they get cancer, right? That's a pretty simple, direct line of causation from the use of ozone depleting substances to those health impacts. When we look at climate change, however, it's a totally different system. How does climate change impact your health? Well, it depends on what part of climate change you're looking at, because climate change means rising temperatures, extreme weather, there are impacts of air quality, and increases in vector-borne diseases. So those are diseases that are carried by organisms like mosquitoes. And what that looks like is a big, complicated mess. And so we don't really have a direct line of causation between the causes of climate change, the impacts on human health. It's this big, complicated web. And there's really no single way to address any of these health effects because it's all embedded in that complicated web. So that's a huge problem. What about in schools? My experience with working with school cafeterias is that these are a wicked problem. So, for example, during the Obama administration, they updated food quality standards for school cafeterias that participated in the free and reduced lunch programs, which meant most schools in the United States. And what they did is they said, we're going to increase the access to whole grains like brown rice. We're going to decrease salt. We're going to decrease, fats. We're going to decrease sugar. And so basically overnight, they changed these standards. And the result was that schools had to shift dramatically from, using the, sort of pre-packaged meals that were cheap and easy for staff to just reheat and serve. but had all kinds of, salt and fats and sugars, et cetera. And they replaced all of that with like lots of leafy greens, brown rice, lots of whole grain breads, things like that, things that you would expect it to result in improvement in health. The problem was that students weren't familiar with those food items. So instead of eating all of their lunches, they would eat some of it and then they would throw the rest away. So overnight, basically, food waste in the cafeteria skyrocketed, as did expenses. So a lot of schools, in order to reduce costs, had shifted away from preparing foods on campus to having foods delivered and then reheated and served to students. But you can't do that with these higher quality food items. So there were a lot of schools that had, budgets that were just exploding because of this one single change. And I think that's fairly characteristic of wicked problems. You could also examine social interactions. You could also examine all kinds of the impacts or the things that happen that affect student behavior. And you would find that there is a similar pattern where small changes have massive responses throughout the whole system, and it's very complicated and difficult to solve. So what do we do given the nature of these sustainability problems? So our traditional approaches are just not up to the task of solving wicked problems. Here's our traditional approach, right? And this is certainly how I started teaching. And I'm ashamed to say, this is probably the bulk of my approach to teaching when I was a teacher. So you start with a problem and you think, here's this problem. And if only my students knew about this problem, they would have better awareness. And if they are aware of the problem, then they will be motivated to change, and that will fix the problem. And I'll give you a perfect example. When I was a substitute teacher for a group of fifth graders, they were very interested in the recycling program in the school. And I thought, you know what you need to know about the recycling program is that plastics are a tremendous problem for seabirds. And so I showed this video of seabirds. They pick up plastic in the oceans, they feed it to their babies. The babies die because of impacted stomachs, because their stomachs and digestive systems get full of plastic. And so not only at the end of the class, not only did I have, like 12 fifth grade students crying because it was such a horrific video. A few days later, I saw the water delivery person bringing in like a pallet of water bottles and like a group of students like just screaming at him that he's killing seabirds. I sort of chalked that up to a personal victory at the time, but really, did it change anything? Did it fix the problem? Absolutely not, because after that initial like shock and terror, those students just went back to their daily lives. They didn't really continue to address the problem effectively. And so that's an important lesson. Here's kind of what happens when we use this approach. We think about, here we are now in the bottom left corner here, not very sustainable. And we want to get up to the top right corner of this graph, which is this amazing future where all these sustainable systems are in place and people's needs are met and everything is going well. And what we do then is we have this kind of path. This is certainly how I taught my environmental science classes early on. We do a boring lecture on climate change. We assign some written reports on how plastics kill sea turtles. I make the students watch a video on municipal solid waste because that's fascinating, right? And then calculate how much pollution you create by failing to carpool. And at the end of this process, we actually can do damage to. We can have people lose interest or feel hopeless or stop even trying to make a difference here in terms of sustainability. And the reason I know this is because I asked at the end of the year, I asked my students to create memes because they were big into social media, create memes that communicated the most important messages from the class. And this is what I got. Identifying soil. Yep, it's soil. That was the meme that was generated after my 6-week introduction to soil science. How great is that? But you can see these are really pessimistic. These are really not the kind of message that I hope to have conveyed to my students. And so we need a totally different approach. And that approach is this. If we're working towards systemic change, we really need to influence people in these core areas, and probably lots of others that aren't even on this slide. So we have to inspire people to have a desire for action. We have to cultivate empathy in people. We have to identify our shared values and work together to achieve them, to pursue them. We have to have open-ended investigations. That means that your students need to be able to explore the areas of sustainability that they are most interested in. We need to, you know, bring about systems that promote collaboration. And most importantly, I think, is we have to find a way to make sustainability culturally relevant to our students. And so that might mean taking a backseat on the interests, your personal interests in sustainability, and allowing students to really explore what sustainability means in terms of what's most important to them culturally. For a lot of my students, that meant finding ways to promote social justice, whereas I would have thought finding ways to promote environmental safety or environmental quality would have been, the thing that was most motivating. And so during the course, as I got better at teaching things about sustainability, shifting the focus from the things that I wanted to explore to the things that they wanted to explore was one important tool for getting them to be interested in creating change.